of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening. We are opening. We are opening. We are opening. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening in sweet surrender. We are opening. We are open in sweet surrender. We are luminous love light of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are open in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are open in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are open in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One.
Welcome to the 60-minute lightning quick workshop, better described perhaps as a class, given the amount of time we have, called Deep Ecumenism and its Alternatives. I'm Laura Kaplan, and I will try to do in this workshop one of the things that I do well, which is provide several theoretical models that we can use to think about things in more than one way, and hopefully in at least one way that is different from a way that we already think about them. Here is my plan. I will talk for a maximum of 30 minutes, and during that time, please interrupt me only if I have failed to define an important term or if I am really making no sense, which sometimes happens mid-afternoon for me, but hopefully will not happen this mid-afternoon. And during that time, I'll just give you a little bit of context about my developing knowledge in the topics I'm speaking about. And then I will tell a little bit of a silly story that was eye-opening for me. And then I will move actually to the second page of this handout that some of you have. That's just what's up here, the handout that was posted on the website. And talk about some of the ideas on that page. And then at that 30-minute mark, I will stop and give you two choices of how you might like to proceed. And we will somehow magically discern the will of the group. We'll make it come back on when it's needed. For the last year and a half, I have been teaching at the Vancouver School of Theology, which is an ecumenical Christian seminary in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our student body comes largely from three denominations: United Church of Canada, which is a very liberal denomination; Anglicans, which are analogous to Episcopalians in the U.S., and Presbyterians, which are very much like Episcopalians in the U.S. We also have a large number of Unitarian students. And then we have a few students who are Jewish, such as Marcy, Hindu, seeking, or flat out atheist, trying to reach out to figure out what on earth is going on with their more spiritual friends and neighbors. Our school considers itself a very progressive school, one that responds to important trends and crises in the Christian church, or within all aspects of the Protestant Christian church. And in Canada, we are at some unknown place in the process of reconciliation between Indigenous First Nations people and the Canadian government on addressing the many, many wrongs that were done to Indigenous people and are still done to Indigenous people in the name of the Christianity and the Canadian government. One of the most talked about sets of abuses, not the only one, but one of the most talked about sets of abuses were the residential schools, where, I kid you not, this seems so strange in the 20th century, first century, happened in the 20th century, we all know that horrible things continue to happen, where young Indigenous people, Indigenous youth, were kidnapped from their homes and forced to attend residential schools where they would become acculturated in Western values, and then, thank you, Susan, Christian values, I'll talk about that in a moment, theoretically Western values, and then when school ended, they would be tossed into the foster care system, and at some point, as young adults, be released back into the community. Release is probably a good word. All kinds of terrible abuses, physical, sexual, interpersonal, cultural, intellectual, all kinds of abuses happen in the residential school systems. To say that the Christian churches of Canada were complicit in that would be a really, really gross understatement. Instead, they were active agents because they held most of the contracts for operating the schools. As part of the healing process, the Christian church and the Christian churches in Canada are in the process of a very long road to self-examination and learning from Indigenous partners how to heal some of those abuses. And one of the ways that our school, Vancouver School of Theology, is participating in that is by having a program in Indigenous and interreligious studies. There's Indigenous Christianity and interreligious studies. In my own life, I had just left Or Shalom Synagogue. I hadn't even left yet. I had just given notice at Or Shalom Synagogue. And the person who was leading the interreligious studies program at the school had stepped down. And I got a phone call, is there any chance you'd be willing to help us out, Laura, because you are, so far, the only non-Christian graduate of the Vancouver School of Theology. So, against the objections of certain members of my family, I said yes. Even though I knew absolutely nothing about interreligious studies, and less than absolutely nothing about Indigenous studies. And they said, oh, we're so glad you're here. You can teach the Advanced Integrating Seminar in Indigenous and Interreligious Studies. And, oh, we're so glad you're here. You can come to the Native Ministries Consortium, and you can teach the Indigenous students about non-Christian religions. Great. This part of the introduction is by way of saying that my knowledge is a beginner's knowledge, a work in progress. I am learning as I teach, just enough to be able to teach and open up rich dialogue with our students who come from a diverse set of backgrounds. All of this knowledge comes from a combination of books and experience of dialoguing our way through this material. And the other part of my introduction is just to say that in the Canadian social context, as well as the American social context, issues of interreligious encounter and the question of how to do that in a way that we are not engaging in what Art Green called yesterday interreligious imperialism or interreligious colonialism are very, very live, hot issues affecting the daily lives of large numbers of people.
Definition,
Yes.
colonialism, and colonialism,
The definition that we sort of have in the back of our minds when we talk about it at VST is a takeover of land and resources belonging to another group for the ultimate purpose of economic exploitation and the use of all kinds of legal and illegal means, right, of oppression and re-education in order to facilitate the taking of those resources.
You're not talking about religious colonialism.
That's, religious colonialism is put in our context, religious colonialism is put in the service of economic colonialism. Actively, overtly, consciously. Cannot say the Canadian churches did not know where they were participating. That's by way of introduction. I will now get to the silly story about deep ecumenism. At the Sunday night opening, which I know everybody attended because it's so preferable to go into whatever party you were at or sleeping off the effects of air travel. But at the opening, I just mentioned that the term deep ecumenism was made famous in the writings of American priest, Catholic, later Episcopal, and theologian Matthew Fox. To summarize that concept in one sentence, he liked to say, or likes to say, religious traditions are differently formed wells drawing water from the one river of divine spirit. It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But when you begin to approach other people with that idea, this is what my story will illustrate. When you begin to approach people of other faiths, as a person of faith, with that idea in mind, it's too easy to imagine that the one river of divine spirit is exactly as you conceptualize the divine in your religious tradition. And that for that reason, as well as other obvious reasons, I really like Rev Zalman's alternative formulation of ecumenism, that the world is like a single living body and each human spiritual tradition is a vital organ. We all work together for the health of the planet, and in fact, we all depend on one another in historical and cultural ways that we are all beginning to learn about during these few days. The silly story is about the day that I realized the limitations of deep ecumenism. And it is really a silly story. I promised that I would take my young adult daughter to the mall to buy a lipstick at the MAC cosmetic counter. So we went to the MAC cosmetic counter, and it soon becomes apparent that my daughter is taking this visit very seriously. She's an artist, she's an emerging costume designer, makeup and stage makeup is a really important part of that. So she is going to try on every single lipstick in the store. And they've got names, the names are amazing. Zen Garden, Divine Kiss, Spirit Rose. So I'm looking at the names, and I'm trying to find ways to entertain myself. And I suddenly see this little kerfuffle going on between some customer and one of the staff people. I have an extra chair here. I am not going to sit down. Somebody pass this chair back?
There's an extra chair here. This spot doesn't really work, but there's a chair.
There's a little kerfuffle between, I'll show you this later, between one customer and one member of the staff. So being bored and inappropriately curious, I come over to eavesdrop. And it turns out that the customer has a gift certificate to the store that they want to sell back to the store because they're a student, they just graduated with their PhD, they really do not have money for cosmetics, and wasn't there any customer there who was shopping that could really use it? So I said, fine, pick me. And of course, I said, oh, what did you finish your PhD in? Oh, I'm a musicologist, I did something on the spirituality of music and the vibrations of different tones in the different denominations and traditions, and I thought, wow. I said, so, you know, I work in this field too. I am blah, 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 a rabbi Jewish. And she said, wow, you know, both of us are hoping for the same thing. Why, do you know Rabbi blah, 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 I don't remember the name, in Jerusalem, and all of the great talks he's bringing, and all the people he's bringing into the fold? And she's describing him, and I suddenly realized he's a messianic rabbi. And in the moment I grasped, she believes that what unites all religious traditions is the yearning for Messiah. And at that moment, right, amid the Zen rose and the divine kiss and all those beautiful colors, I realized that I imagine that all religious traditions are actually yearning to bathe in the river of Ein Sof. And that is exactly the same kind of preconception, right, that shuts down my ability to understand what I am receiving from other people, just as much as her messianic conception, I knew in that moment, was shutting me down. And I began to attend worship services at work. We go to Christian worship together, sometimes every day, sometimes once a week. It's a wacky mixed bag from all the denominations the students have had, but I began to attend them with a much different heart and a much different willingness to understand what the heck are all these different denominations trying to say in their different languages. Worship often goes over it. No, I'm not answering that question. That's just a big change that came over me when I realized I had to let go of deep ecumenism. As I would put it, I would sit in the service and I would wear my deep ecumenism like armor. I know exactly what they're saying. I know what this prayer means, I know what this hymn means, but I really didn't know anything. And in our classes, we started to talk about that. We talked a lot about VST, about the limitations of a view like deep ecumenism, because it can so easily be used in service of that religious colonialism that we talked about. Now, all of you come into our fold. You're really part of us. You think as we do. You behave as we do. We are one in spirit, even if we are taking your money and your land as you join us. So we talk a lot about what are different ways of understanding the interreligious encounter. And I will speak very briefly about three that I really love. The first one is not invented by, but conceptualized by a fabulous writer named Francis Clooney. American Jesuit priest, scholar of Hinduism, alive, flourishing, writing today. To summarize his work in one sentence: allow the divine to speak to you through the symbols of other traditions so that you may deepen your understanding of your own tradition. He gives a beautiful example in one of his books of being in a tiny temple in a tiny town in India, the kind where the devotional statues are all dressed in the tackiest glittery clothing from Walmart. And he's standing there. God forbid, but Walmart is probably not that far from here. Speaking of colonialism. And suddenly, he feels addressed by the goddess through one of those statues. And he describes his experience in the moment. He says, "Oh my God, I feel the goddess. She is speaking to me." I believe it was Lakshmi, but my memory is sometimes not perfect. She's speaking to me. Wait a minute. I can't do this. I'm a Jesuit priest. This doesn't happen. I better shut down. Oh, wait a minute. But I'm doing ethnographic research. I can open. But wait a minute, I might convert. I should close. All this inner dialogue is happening as he's standing in front of the statues. And finally, he lets go, feels addressed by the goddess, goes home and tries to process his experience. And where does it take him? He goes back to the analog, or an analog, or what he deems an analog to goddess traditions in Christianity, which lead him through fabulous hymns to Mother Mary, which lead him into the mystical visions of sojourner truth. And it wasn't until he allowed himself to be addressed by something alien to him that he was able to see the life within those symbols in his own tradition. Previously, they were ho-hum to him. Through this moment of being open to something divine and new, he understood female divinity in a way that he had never would have understood had he stayed within the language of Christianity. So he says. And he invites everyone, even if you're not a scholar, everyone who generally wants to be open to interreligious encounter. And this is an amazing thing, to allow yourself to go into alien territory and expect to be addressed. Not sit there saying, this is just your language for Ein Sof. But what if you got gods, goddesses, God, goddess, alike? And it's not easy, and it's part of the reason why interreligious dialogue is really difficult when done in a synagogue to church to mosque to temple context. Because one of the big businesses of each local religious organization is to define and defend what it is, particularly within its own tradition. And it's very difficult to switch hats and say, we're here to be open to something different. I believe I have 7 minutes to my half-hour mark.
Okay.
I also really love the concept named Ethical Engagement by Willie Ermine, a Canadian Indigenous legal scholar, contemporary writer. He says one of the things that tends to happen, in some contexts blatant, in others subtle, aspects of religious, let's call this imperialism rather than colonialism, but I won't define just now. You can let those terms mean whatever they mean to you. One of the aspects of it is you come into dialogue, or you come together to solve a community problem. And one group has designed the format. One group has designed the language. One group has set the goals. And it can't, not to say it can't possibly, but it is not very likely to become a space in which a genuine encounter happens. He is speaking specifically of Indigenous Canadian and Euro-Canadian encounters, but it's a great concept that moves beyond that. He says if you truly want to have an encounter, the first step needs to be understanding enough in advance about one another's culture, doing collaborative pre-planning through research and small conversations in order to define a meeting place that makes use of and makes space for different cultures' understandings of what the God encounter might be, what the interfaith encounter might be, what the goal might be. And of course, he is a great fan of equalizing kinds of strategies. In one of his videotape teachings, he talks about a meeting that he thought would be quite scary to talk about Indigenous issues and begin to put harms and pleas for forgiveness onto the table. There have been and still are many such meetings going on in Canada. And he asked for permission to start it off from the organizers. And he started it off by asking every single person to remove their shoes and sit on the floor together. And he said, this is a small gesture, it's a ritual gesture, it isn't incorporated into the ultimate legal goals of what we're talking about, but it may require everybody to be equal as a starting point. The very first thing we did was depart in a surprise from anyone's concept of the agenda and do something where we were all a little bit naked and on the same level. Of course, people who couldn't sit on the floor got a chair. That did not diminish the point. And he asks, invites, demands, suggests that anyone who is having an encounter that has previously been marked by suspicion or inequality or difficulties, think about what kinds of tones they can set so that people begin to define the space together. The last one that I'm going to share about is another one of my favorites. This is from the work of the three interfaith amigos, as they call themselves.
Yeah.
You may have met them. Imam Jamal Rahman, Pastor Don McKenzie, Rabbi Ted Falcon. They've all been to Vancouver a few times. And they say, you know, it doesn't make sense to define a theology of what different faiths have in common before you start the encounter. It doesn't really make sense to define specifically what the process is. It doesn't even make sense to decide in advance that we're going to call this a dialogue where everyone meets, you know, in some Buberian I-thou space. Doesn't make sense to say, okay, we're calling this an encounter, or we're calling this a problem-solving group. So you have to realize that what you're engaging in is an activity, and you do not know what it is before you start. Instead, you are just committing to some kind of a journey. And they said, in our experience, the journey has 5 stages. They didn't say, anyone who is setting up an interfaith encounter must set up these 5 stages. This is their experience. The first stage, they said, is moving beyond separation and suspicion.